Hi guys, my name is Nicole York. I am a narrative and conceptual portrait photographer and an Fstoppers staff writer. Today I am here with Jacqueline and we are going to show you how to make the most of shooting in small spaces. We are here today in Las Vegas, Nevada at WPPI, and we really wanted to show you guys how you can make the most of the space that you're shooting in. I know it can be really frustrating to see these amazing photographers shooting in great big studios or out on these exotic locations and feel like unless you can do that, your work isn't going to be as good as theirs or as compelling as theirs. But you can do a lot in a small space. Most of us shoot in our garages or our living rooms or our bedrooms. And so in this little Airbnb, we just found an open space and we're basically going to show you how you can work a space to create an epic photograph. When you're putting together a conceptual image, it's important to think it through all the way from the beginning. And everything that you do should serve that story. So from the dress to the design, from the crown to this beautiful makeup by makeup artist Sylvia Hacks, we have basically put together a cohesive look that helps tells the story of this beautiful maiden who is probably in a garden somewhere, maybe in the countryside, and we're even going to use props that help show that. So the makeup is very simple, it's not overly dramatic, it beautifully highlights her features, plays into the color of the dress, and then also with our prop you'll see soon, we have some flowers that kind of mimic some of the colors in the makeup. So everything we're using comes together to help tell this story. Now in this space, we're lucky that we don't have too many issues to deal with. We have fairly neutral walls, and though the ceilings aren't very high, I think that's something we can work around. You're gonna be able to see us build this shot from the ground up and deal with the problems that come up. So the first thing that I want to address, the first issue we're gonna face is we have this ambient light that's coming in behind us. So because we're working in a small space, I have brought in a 4x6 backdrop that was painted by Kate Woodman, and it's the perfect size to allow us to not only hide this ambient light, but also to make our model look fantastic. It's a beautiful blue-gray instead of this taupe that we have on the walls, and we're gonna cover up that light so that it keeps the extra light from hitting her from the back. That way we have light control, and it's gonna allow us to have a clean slate to composite later. Awesome, so our backdrop is in place. We've taken care of this ambient light and given ourselves a beautiful scene to work with. The reason I'm using a hand-painted backdrop in this scenario is because I want an amazing image, whether the composite works or not. So while I am planning on compositing in a backdrop, if something goes wrong, I always have this beautiful backdrop to work off. It's classic and the image is going to be fantastic in either case. For optimal control of lighting, today I'm going to be using the brand new Elinchrom ELC studio lights. I have a 500 and a 125 that I'm going to be using for the key light and for the accent light. So I've got my camera, we're all ready. I'm going to take a quick shot to make sure that we don't have any ambient light contamination. Now my settings are f8 at 200th of a second and my ISO is at 200. As you can see from the shot, we have no problems with ambient light. If you do have a problem with ambient light, one of the things you can do is use the high-speed sync built into these strobes. You can raise your shutter speed to the point that ambient light just can't hit the sensor. Luckily, we don't have that problem today, so let's just go ahead and add our first light and see what we can come up with. So I've got my light in position. I've added this Elinchrom Skyport so that I can control each light individually and control the power. I have the power set to 4 right now, and I'm just going to take a shot and see how this looks. So looking at the back of my camera, what I can see is the general position of the light is good, but the problem is it's very hot, the light is super hard, it's bouncing everywhere, it's casting shadows across my backdrop and unflattering shadows on my model's face. So to combat these issues, I'm going to use my favorite modifier. It is the Elinchrom Rotolux 39-inch Deep Octa. Now I've added the modifier, we're pointing directly at the model. Let's take another shot and see how it looks. Go ahead and step just a bit to your right for me. There we go. Checking out this shot, I can clearly see that the modifier has helped a lot. The diffusion has given us a softer light. It's more flattering on the model. It has softened those shadows, but we still have a couple of problems here. The light is still just a little bit overexposed, and a lot of light is hitting the backdrop. I want a good separation between my model and the backdrop. I think I would rather have less light hitting the backdrop. So what I'm going to do now is just feather this light a little bit. That way I maintain the shape that I like, and I have a proper exposure without getting too much light on the backdrop. So rather than having the light pointing directly at the model, I feathered it at about 90 degrees. This means that the model is only being lit by the light spills from the side. It keeps the light off the backdrop and still gives me that same flattering light shape. Let's take a quick shot and see how it looks. It's beautiful. So now we have a proper exposure because now that the light is not facing her directly, it's not as powerful. So we've cut down on the power a little bit. We've maintained this beautiful light shape. My background is nice and dark, which means there's good separation between the model and the background. And to boot, the diffusion is gorgeous. Now, one of the things I do want to mention is that because we're in a small space and this is at a 90-degree angle to our model, it's pointing directly at the wall, which means that the light is bouncing off that wall and filling in our shadows. So we don't need to add any additional lights or reflectors in order to have shadow fill. That's one thing that could really come in handy if you're shooting in a small space. If you don't want fill in the shadows, you can always add something like a black flag, a V-flat, even just a shower curtain that's black will stop that light from bouncing back in and give you a little bit more control. So even though I love this shot, I do think it could benefit from a little bit of accent light. That will separate the model from the backdrop, and since I think I want to put it coming from the same side, which will kind of give us this wrapping quality. We'll have the accent light that wraps around to the key light, and that'll almost make it feel like we're outside and maybe the light is coming from behind her and maybe bouncing off something and lighting up her face. So I'm going to add my ELC 125, and let's put it back here and just see what position we need to get it in to make everything look great. Now I've got my accent light set up, and they're set to the same channel so that they fire at the same time. And I know that because this light has a really cool feature. It has a little LED light on the side that you can actually change the color of depending on what channel the light is. So these are both lit up blue, and that's how I know they're on the same channel. So let's take a shot and see how this accent light looks where it's at. This is actually really pretty, but it's not quite right. There's still some spill on the backdrop, and though I have now some pretty light in her hair, instead of being high and really making her glow, it's coming from low and the side. So let's move it and see if we can fix this problem. So I've now put the light behind and above the backdrop so that it spills down on our model and just gives her a heavenly glow. Let's see if it actually worked. Now the light is coming toward the camera. I have a little bit of a glow. We have this beautiful separation between the model and the backdrop, and the key light is giving us gorgeous shape and flattering her face. So we've pretty much nailed the lighting. One of the things I think really helps to sell the authenticity of shoots where you want to look like you've maybe gone off into the wilderness or that you're just not shooting in a basement is to add props that help tell the story. I've done this in the past with things like clouds to look like sets of heaven and angel wings. And today, since I wanted to do something with a medieval theme, we have not only this beautiful dress and the jewelry, but I grabbed a simple garland of flowers from a local craft store. I just kind of made it into a circle. I thought it would be a really fun idea to let this be the foreground. And if I were to shoot through the middle and let this foreground kind of blur a little bit, then it might look like we happen to see this beautiful maiden through a garden somewhere. So for help with this, today I'm going to bring in an assistant. Her name is Olga Tinyanin. She's an amazing boudoir photographer out of Portland, Oregon. But if you're on your own, you can always use a clamp and put this to anything like a light stand or anything that's vertical and have it hold it for you. So we have everything all framed up. I have this beautiful foreground element, and since I'm shooting with the Sigma Art 50mm 1.4 lens, I'm at the right distance to get a beautiful shot that is about 3/4, so head, shoulders, torso. And it lets me get relatively close to the model so that this foreground element gets blurred out. Because we're shooting in a relatively small space and I'm using this Sigma 50mm art lens, I need to have this foreground element about 2 feet or so from my lens so that it gets a nice blur and lets us focus through it to our model. Let's go ahead and take a shot and see if it's working. All right, I am loving this. The light is fantastic. The foreground element has a good amount of blur. The model looks beautiful. The final touch I want to add just to bring this image all together is a little bit of wind in the model's hair to give us that feeling that she's actually outdoors. So we're going to bring in another assistant just to add that little bit of wind. Let's see how it goes. And, oh, that's beautiful. Everything is right where it's at. Gorgeous. Okay, this is working really well. We're just gonna work this setup and see if we can come up with a few great shots. Okay, that wraps it up. I have everything I need. These images are beautiful and I cannot wait to get them in post. Even though the backdrop looks gorgeous, I'm going to bring in a digital backdrop to see if we can get it looking like we've been outside somewhere. We want to give big thanks to our beautiful model. If you want to follow her work on Instagram, she goes by Holly Blue. We'll provide the link. Make sure you show her some love. She's amazing. Okay, let's jump into post, find our backdrop, and give this image some magic. All right, guys, we had an incredible shoot. We got some images that I really love, and now we're just gonna go through a quick rundown of how I clean up and prepare this image, but the most important part is how we completely transform this image from looking like it was taken inside to looking like it may be outside. We're gonna add a little bit of magic. So this is the image that I've chosen. It's one of my favorites from the set. I love the movement that's in the hair. The light is beautiful. Her expression is gorgeous. And the first thing that I'm going to do is just go in and make sure that the skin is cleaned up, that there's nothing distracting, and then I will edit the color just a little bit before we drop in our backdrop from the backdrop studio. So the first thing I'm going to do is just zoom in really quick, and I'm going to look for things that might distract the eye. So I'm going to create a new layer, and I'm going to use that to heal little distractions and just remove them so that they don't pull the viewer's eye away from what's important. I'm going to use the healing brush set to current and below on a size that is similar to the area that I want to work on. If I choose a brush size that is much too large, then I'm going to end up replacing texture that I don't want to lose. So there are just a couple small texture issues that I will heal really quickly. If this were a beauty image, I might approach things a little bit differently, maybe with a clone tool, but in this case, I think the healing brush is just the perfect thing. So I'm just gonna remove a few of these distractions. And then after that, we will do some quick dodge and burn to even the transition. So in the meantime, let's speed things up and get all this taken care of. So I noticed that a little bit of the background is missing from the side of the image. I'm just going to replace that with the clone tool. I'll make sure that the clone tool is set to current and below so that while I'm on this empty layer, it still functions properly. And I'll just select something that's nearby, and I'll select a few different places so that I'm not repeating the patterns and the colors too closely, since the background has a little bit of a mottled effect. You could also potentially select this and do a fill with content aware, and that would probably work as well. But this will be quick, so I'm just going to do it this way. Now that I've removed any distracting texture issues and fixed the backdrop a little bit, I'm going to go in with 2 new layers, and I'm going to dodge and burn just to even out the transitions a little bit. To dodge and burn, I'm going to create 2 curves adjustment layers. The first one, I'm going to pull down the center where the midtones are at just a little bit. I'm going to rename it Burn. And then I'm going to invert the mask using Control-I or Command-I so that the mask is black and it hides the effect. I'm going to do the same thing to the top layer, except that I'm going to drag the midtones up just a little bit. Not too far, because if you go too far, then you end up with some color issues. I'm going to rename this one Dodge. And then I'm going to invert the layer mask to hide the effect so I can paint it on using a soft white brush. I want to start working out a little bit because if you start in too close, then you're liable to make corrections that don't actually need to be made. I want my opacity to be very low, somewhere down below 10%. I leave the flow alone, but that's a personal taste issue. I'm going to look for areas where the light transitions and see whether or not they're smooth. So when highlight moves to mid-tone and when mid-tone moves to shadow, I'm going to make sure that that all has a smooth gradation, that it doesn't look bumpy or have too much of a shocking difference. I'm keeping zoomed out so I can see what I'm doing very clearly. And then I'm just using a soft brush so that the edges aren't clear. They should blend a little bit better. And I'm just picking a few of the areas where I can see that the transitions aren't as smooth. It takes a while to train your eye to be able to do this, but it is one of the more powerful ways to put that finesse into the image. If I toggle this on and off, you can see that the dodging is already starting to make a difference. So I'm going to keep at this and then we'll speed it up so we can get through and you can see how this works. All right, so I've got my healing and cloning done. I've got the dodge and burn to a place that I think really enhances the image without making everything look plastic. Let's toggle on and off so you can see the difference. Here's the dodge and burn, and it's very subtle, but sometimes those subtle differences are enough to take an image from ordinary to extraordinary. And now that that's done, I'm going to go look through a group of backdrops that I have from the Backdrop Studio and choose one that I think is really suitable for this image. When you're working this way, you have a couple of options. One of the things that you can do is plan your image around a backdrop that you'd like to use, paying attention to things like the light quality and light direction in the backdrop so you can mimic those when you're photographing. In this case, I've taken the photograph knowing that I have a few good backdrops in here that might possibly work. So I'm going to grab a few, I'm going to drop them in, and let's see if we can find one that perfectly fits this image. So I've pulled up this set of backdrops from the Backdrop Studio, and as you can see, we have a lot of fantastic images to choose from. Some that are of nature, some of skies. There are a couple that I have in mind that I thought might be great options. One here that is a castle through the trees, and since we have a queen or a princess here, that might be a fantastic one to use. Also, we have one called Lady's View, which looks like it's looking out over a hillside down into a really gorgeous view. So let's grab a couple and see which one works the best for us. I think I'm going to start with Crenellation. So I'm going to go down and just grab this image and drop it right in. Make sure that the size is approximate. And since I don't need to worry about this area below, this will work for now. Once I have it in place, I'm going to choose how to apply it. So I'm going to go over here to the blending modes, and I'm just going to roll through and see which one allows the backdrop to be covered by our new digital backdrop while still giving me some leniency in how I mask out the subject and the foreground that I've chosen. So screen definitely seems like a good option. Color dodge, probably a little bit too dark. Linear dodge is also a great option here. So this will be heavily dependent on the backdrop that you shoot and what type of digital backdrop you're dropping in, but it's always a good idea just to run through the options and see which one gives you the best leeway. In this case, I think linear dodge gives us the most options. It puts the backdrop in without being overwhelming, and it does not eat the entire image by blocking everything else out. This means I'll actually be able to see the subject while I'm masking out the parts that I want to keep the backdrop off of. So what I'll do at this point is I will add a layer mask, and then I will grab a big soft white brush, And this time I will bring the opacity all the way up to 100. I'll make the brush large, and then I'll start just some simple basic masking. This doesn't have to be difficult. We don't have to go in with a tiny brush and do all the details. We just want to get a feel. So I'm using a black mask so I can get rid of the backdrop on the places like the foreground here and our subject. And it's just going to be loose and quick to see whether or not this backdrop really is going to work for what we want. Now, once the backdrop is in, the next thing I'm going to do, once I have a nice loose mask, is I'm going to start playing with the opacity, and I might even add a few clipping adjustment layers to the mask itself. So I may try to play with the luminosity, I might play with the color a little bit just to see if I can get it to fit really well. One of the tricks is to make sure that the color that you're working and the luminosity that you're working fit the original image. So in this case, if I allow the backdrop to stay at 100% opacity, it's bright and it's actually distracting from our subject. I want to bring that brightness back down so that it matches at least enough the luminosity of the original backdrop so that it still feels cohesive. So I've brought down the opacity a little bit because I want to give a hint of the backdrop without having it overwhelm the image. And then I'm going to grab just a simple curves mask or a curves adjustment layer, and I'm going to clip it to our backdrop, and I'm going to play with the curves just a little bit to see what happens to the backdrop when I raise or lower the luminosity of the midtones. Sometimes it works beautifully, sometimes it is a complete failure, but the key here is to just play a little bit and see if you can get something that works. We don't necessarily want to make this look like we actually traveled to Europe and found ourselves a castle. We want to give a hint of the place so that it feels like she's there without being a distraction. So this is definitely a contender. We've just done a really quick look at what this backdrop would look like. I'm going to drop in a couple more just to see if I have a better option, but we'll speed this up using the same process so you have an idea of what it looks like to give a couple backdrops a try, to look for that blending mode, and then to make it match. After trying a couple of these backdrops, I think Morning Mist is the winner. It matches the color palette, it has the same romantic feel to it, and it gives me a lot of leeway, and it makes masking really easy because when I have it set to screen like this, I'm not losing a lot of the shadows in the original image to the backdrop. I've also gone ahead and added a levels mask, clipped that to my backdrop, and then played with the levels a little bit to get it to blend even better and allow me to be able to mask really easily. So this is just after a quick mask. I'm going to dial in the mask a little bit, and then our backdrop will basically be set, and we have an image that has a really classic feel that feels like it could have been taken anywhere, and then we'll play with the color grading a little bit just to finish everything off, and we'll be done. So right now, as I'm dialing in the layer mask, I'm basically just looking for areas where the mask is bleeding through onto the foreground or the subject, and areas that I don't want the mask to appear. The cool thing about having these out of focus elements in the foreground is that often when you are having a blurred forward focus, you have some see-through. You're actually able to kind of see through the edges of the blurred object. So in this case, using this big soft brush, I don't have to be absolutely perfect because our eyes expect us to see a little bit of kind of sharing between the out of focus and the behind elements. So that gives us a little bit of room to play. But when it comes to things like the subject, where our focus should be, we have to dial everything in a little bit more carefully. So in this case, I'm going to choose to use a smaller, harder brush, and I'm going to come in and be really deliberate about where I allow this mask to fall. The edges where the hair is blowing is a great place to let the color of the mask bleed through because it adds that sense of connection between the subject and the mask, or not the mask, but the subject and the background. So the background has a lot of these kind of yellows and greens, and if I let that bleed through into the hair just a little bit, then it looks like the background is actually affecting the subject, which is something that we want. Because I've added this levels adjustment to the background, I've been able to kind of dial in how it affects the midtones and the darker areas, and that lets me have a little bit of comfort in my masking. I don't have to be quite as deliberate as I would if I needed to keep the backdrop from everything. In this case, I don't have to because it's not affecting those areas as strongly. So I can be a little bit looser with my masking than I might be in other cases. Every now and then, I'm going to lower the opacity so that I can actually build up the transition with several brush strokes. That way, the transition between the subject and the background and the way that the background affects things like the flying hair happens a little bit more gradually and just kind of fools the eye into thinking that these things are related. Now that I've got a background that really works with our image and I have a general mask in place, I'm just going to play with the opacity and the levels adjustment layer that I've clipped to the backdrop just to make sure that everything feels like it is cohesive and like the backdrop and the foreground were meant to fit together. Once I've done that, I'm going to do some quick color grading and we're going to have a finished image. So it looks to me like the background works best when our levels adjustment is about 67% and when the backdrop itself is about 47% opacity. And when I toggle this on and off, you can see that it is subtle, it's not overpowering, it gives us a sense of place without making it feel like we have tried to perfectly composite her into a place she never was to begin with. This is a really nice way that you can make your images feel like you've been standing outside in some beautiful location without actually having to travel there or without making a lot of the big mistakes that can happen when you're doing exact compositing, which requires shooting back plates, mimicking the light direction and the light quality, shooting with the same focal length from the same angle. In this case, we can have a lot more leeway in how we put together the backdrop and the subject. I'm really happy with where we're at with the backdrop, so let's just finish this off with some color grading to make the whole thing feel cohesive. I generally start my color grading with a color balance layer. This allows me to affect the shadows and the midtones and the highlights separately and choose which colors are most apparent in those areas. Now, for images that feel like they're outdoors in nature, I often like to have them either warm or cool depending on what time of day I think is approximate. For this image, we want a kind of dreamy quality, and there's already some reds in the backdrop. So I'm going to try to add some reds to the shadows. I'm going to push a little bit of greens into the mid-tone. And then in the highlights, I'll play a little bit. I'm going to try some cyan for some contrast. And that definitely has a kind of a dreamy, otherworldly feel that works with the backdrop. But I also want to try a little bit of the warm tones and see how those work. Now, warm tones seem to affect the image on a much grander scale. So what I like to do is I like to change my blending mode to color. That way, all that's affected is the color and the luminosity is left out of the equation. Now, often what I will do is I will try a couple of different layers. I will try the color balance 1 or 2 times in a couple of different ways just to see if there's something I like better than my original idea. In this case, I'm going to add a little bit of yellow to the shadows, a little bit of red to the midtones, and then go contrasting with the highlights and play with a couple of different things just to see what works. And since there's a lot of red in this image, I actually think that I really like having some greens in there to make those reds pop. I think this makes it feel kind of dreamy. The last thing I like to do is just press F to get rid of the rest of my desktop so that I can see the image all by itself, just to see whether or not everything works. And in this case, I think playing up the greens a little bit allows the red in her lips and this dress to really pop, separates her from the backdrop really well, and kind of pulls the backdrop and the foreground together, making them feel like they were always meant to be part of the same image. I'm super happy with where this image is at. The last thing I'm gonna do is crop just a little bit to get rid of some of the dead space on the bottom and the side, and we'll have a finished image. All right, guys, that wraps up this image. I'm super happy with the shoot and everything we got to create today. And I really hope that what you saw today inspires you to create in whatever space you have available. You don't have to have a great big studio. Sometimes all you have to have is an 8x8 space and an Airbnb in a city you don't even live in to create something that's magic. As long as you understand how to use light, you're brave and you're willing to experiment a little bit in Photoshop, and you can use your imagination. If you guys want to learn more, subscribe to the Fstoppers YouTube channel or check out fstoppers.com for daily articles.